Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the United Nations Human Rights Council, which has discussed in an urgent meeting the systemic racism, as it calls it, within the United States. We also had George Floyd's brother, in fact, addressing the council as well, saying that African Americans need the international community's help as well in regards to the systemic racism that they face on a regular basis, police brutality, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. Now, this meeting was spurred by the calls of 54 African countries who are, of course, members of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. They said that, of course, they wanted to look into, quote, the deaths of Africans and people of African descent in the U.S. with the aim of, quote, bringing perpetrators to justice, end quote. Let's discuss all of that a bit further, because one of the contexts that we need to remember as we discuss overall is the United States has already walked away from the Human Rights Council for other reasons. In the past, with Nikki Haley, of course, announcing that the council was going beyond its, of course, goals and was essentially interfering in U.S. affairs. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're now joined by Mark Riley, who is a veteran New York broadcaster and political analyst. He's also a New York-based journalist, but currently he is joining us from Brighton in the UK. We're also joined by Darrin, Porcher, who is a criminal justice expert and television commentator. He's joining us this morning from New York. Darrin and Mark, thank you both for your time today. Mark, let me start with you. How important is the internationalization, if I may say, of this issue of racism within the United States?
It's important, but it has happened before, and not a whole heck of a lot has been done. There were calls after Ferguson in 2014 to try and do something on an international level having to do with American racism and specifically police brutality. When I was a kid, there used to be an expression which was essentially, I know you are, but what am I? And the United States government has a tendency, when these sorts of things come up, to kind of say that, well, this one's bad, and this one's bad, and this one's bad, so don't focus on us. And essentially, that's what the American ambassador said in Switzerland, even though the United States was not represented at that conversation.
Darrin, what are your thoughts on this? Because, of course, we know the U.S. view on the Human Rights Council right now is not very positive. It sees it as biased, one-sided. I mean, the list really goes on with the long complaints list that the U.S. has about the Human Rights Council. Nevertheless, it is the international body which represents the international community. What are your thoughts about it debating racism within the U.S.?
Well, I think that this has been a long-standing practice in the United States, and the systemic values of America have been somewhat overarching for a period of time. And it's just interesting when we look at with the United States, how we react to things from an overseas perspective, such as we go back years ago, back in the 80s, Tiananmen Square, the human rights violations in places like China, across the board. But at the same token, when it comes to a self-correction mechanism here, we shy from it. And it really begs the question of how effective can we be, considering that we proclaim ourselves as being the best democracy in the world. You can either make the opportunity or miss the opportunity. And unfortunately, we've missed an opportunity for years on end. When we just look at the internal issues of over-policing or racism in the United States, this has been something that's deep-rooted within the United States. We go back to the early 90s when we had the beating of Rodney King. Yeah. There was tremendous outcries for, look, we need to make some strides in connection with racial injustice because it's just not being connected with law enforcement. There was a series of panels that were put in play, benchmarks. However, that stuff all went by the wayside in 6 months. So I heard your other guest mention Ferguson. The same held true there. With this incident, I just don't see anything different. And unless you have the proper stakeholders at the table that are willing to buy into the solution, it'll just continue to go awry. So when we had Nikki Haley walk away from the council not too long ago, it really begged the question of, are we really in this? Are we buying in? And the answer to that is no. I just think that we really need to revolutionize our race relations here in the United States, because it puts us to a better place, believe it or not, socioeconomically, because if everyone is a part of the pie, it'll grow at a much faster pace. But as a result, we're seeing something that's just taking us backwards as opposed
Indeed.
to moving us forward.
All right, so then, Mark, the argument is on the part of the U.S. that, listen, we can police ourselves. We can handle our own issues. Don't get involved in our issues. Don't interfere in our internal affairs. And, normally that works for a lot of countries around the world, right? In the sense that there are certain issues of sovereignty where, of course, even the international bodies such as the UN cannot overstep their boundaries. But for the U.S. and for the fact that it's been suffering from the systemic racism for so long and hasn't been able to fix this issue, is it time for the international community to come in and get involved?
It is, but I'm not sure it's going to happen. I agree with Dr. Porcher completely. The bottom line here is this. This is about, when it comes to systemic racism, when it comes to police brutality, et cetera, it is all a byproduct of white supremacy. And as long as white supremacy, which has been part of America's DNA since it was founded, is addressed and dealt with, you're not going to get any kind of systemic change in terms of racism, in terms of police brutality, or for that matter, anything else having to do with race. America is very, very touchy about race, always has been. In a New York expression, it's like the third rail of American life. A lot of people simply do not want to confront issues pertaining to race. And as I see it now, people are focused on it, but the cameras are starting to be turned off. People are starting to go back to their lives. Systemic change comes when people bring these issues up during inconvenient times, nationally or internationally. And that, I'm not sure, is about to happen this time around.
That's an interesting point, Darrin, where we may very well get distracted very soon, because that's just how the news cycle works, right? Where we concentrate on something and then we move on to the next thing. Do you think that we're all going to go back to status quo in some way, and then even the international community will look away? Because it seemed this time, on the part of many, that things were now going to be different, where the U.S. was going to be forced to amend its ways, specifically in its relations with the African-American community?
We will absolutely go back to status quo, and we have to take into consideration the international community's ability to do anything. And the answer to that is no. What can the international community do? What, are they going to invoke sanctions on the United States? We're the largest consumers on the face of this earth. So socioeconomically, we hold a tremendous amount of power. And that is subsequently actually to our default, because that doesn't allow an international community to step in and intervene on what we're doing that's inappropriate. We'll have a whole lot of committees and speeches in connection with what's going to change, but nothing's going to happen. So I think that this one right here is, I see Netflix gave away $100 million, $120 million to HBCUs and, black colleges, basically. Yeah. And, you have a lot of celebrities that are speaking out to, the African-American community is not receiving their fair just. I remember, I think it was last year, Joaquin Phoenix. He's a notable actor, and he received an award. I believe it was an Oscar. And one of the things that he stated was the African-American community is receiving a miscarriage of representation in Hollywood. But nothing happened. The same holds true here. We have the stars that step out, but how you make a systemic change is by being proactive. And the proactiveness is going to, we have to look at these Fortune 500 companies that are unwilling to see people of color in these positions as CEOs. Socioeconomics is the driving force behind our society. Indeed. So when we look to racism, that's more so a symptom of socioeconomic impoverishment, and it's just going to continue unless we have the socioeconomic boom.
Okay. Mark, I'll give you the final word, letting you both go. On that point of socioeconomic realities on the ground, right, for the African-American community and for other minority communities that can be argued as well, but especially for the African-American community, do you think that that will change? And will the African-American community be able to keep up this momentum? Because it does seem, as Darrin there said, a lot of companies are trying to almost hijack the situation, right, where now you have Band-Aids of different skin tones being released, crayons of different skin colors apparently being released as well. It seems that we're all stuck within those very symbolic acts, but will the actual system reform itself, and will that momentum be able to keep going within the country?
Complete and utter superficiality. I remember going 20 years ago to a conference. It was a conference, combined conference of the National Association of Black Journalists, Hispanic Journalists, and Asian Journalists out in Seattle. And while I was out there, every major media outlet was represented, and they all had every kind of sign you could think of talking about diversity. We're going to diversify our newsrooms. We're going to diversify our staffs. We're going to diversify management. They gave away pens that said diversity or bust. But you know what? 10 years later, and that was 10 years ago now, 10 years later, the percentage of blacks in newsrooms across America had not changed. And you can give lip service to a lot of things, but fundamental change requires work. And quite frankly, I'm not sure America is prepared to do the work.
Very well. We'll leave there on a point. But of course, as always, we appreciate Mark and Darrin for their time and, of course, for their expert insight and putting this all into context for ourselves and our viewers. Certainly, the internationalization has happened before, as Mark there correctly mentioned. Of course, it's not the first time the international community has tried to have a say over how the U.S. deals with its issues of systemic racism, which have been, mind you, admitted seemingly in many quarters across the U.S., at least this time around. However, will it be like previous times where we all get distracted and then we all just fall back into status quo, where nothing actually changes on the ground for the African-American community after this outburst of legitimate anger on the part of George Floyd's killing, as well as Rayshon Brooks? And we can, of course, the list is quite endless of those who have been killed in this regard and have not seen justice carried out for them. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Canada's bid for a seat at the United Nations Security Council. It had been vying for that for a number of years now, preparing itself for that. Justin Trudeau had put a lot on the line, and a bit of money was spent in that regard as well. Estimates of $2.3 million, I believe, were spent to try to convince, of course, the international community to vote in Canada onto the Security Council. It has not happened. Canada has lost that bid. But one of those who possibly is going to take credit for Canada not getting the seat, and of course we can argue this out and debate this with our panelists who are joining us, but are those Palestinian activists and other organizations who brought up concerns about how Canada has voted in the past when it comes to the issues regarding the occupied territories, saying that Canada has been perpetually pro-Israel and has not voted ever, essentially, of course, I'm paraphrasing them, in support of Palestinians and their rights, etc. The Canadians, of course, diplomats would argue against that, saying that no, Canada has, in fact, spoken up for Palestinian rights, etc. We just recently had 100 plus organizations and dozens of prominent individuals, and the list is very, very long, including the likes of Noam Chomsky and others who had, in fact, brought up concerns about Canada and whether or not it was a good candidate to be on the UN Security Council, even, of course, as you know, temporarily and not in a permanent seat. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Peggy Mason, who is a former Canadian ambassador for disarmament to the United Nations. She's also the president of the Rideau Institute on International Affairs. She's joining us from Ottawa. Joining us from Montreal is Balsam, who is the national coordinator of Independent Jewish Voices Canada. He's lived previously and worked in the occupied West Bank for Oxfam. And joining us from Toronto is Rodman, who is the director of Just Peace Advocates, which is a Canada-based human rights group with a focus on Palestine and Kashmir. Karen, Corey, and Peggy, thank you to all three of you for your time this morning. Peggy, let me start with you. What do you make of Canada losing its bid to have a seat on the UN Security Council? What, in your opinion, may have led to that failure for it to get that seat?
Well, in a nutshell, Canada was very ill-advised to enter the race against two absolute UN stalwarts, Norway and Ireland. And you said in your intro that Canada had been running for a long time. In fact, we came extraordinarily late to the race. Ireland started campaigning in 2005, Norway in 2007, Canada in 2016. So the fundamental problem, and we can talk about, and the vote in the end was rather close, 20 votes separating Canada from Ireland. So that suggests a rather strong campaign in spite of the fact that we came in so late. But the fundamental problem, which we couldn't overcome, I mean, and we'll discuss various policies which maybe, which definitely contributed. But the fundamental, I wonder if global affairs really put it on the line in the way that they should have when Canada, when the political level, when the Prime Minister said he was gung-ho, he wants Canada to run, he can't wait. I wonder if they really put it on the line that, running against Norway and Ireland was extremely foolhardy, and we've paid the price.
Indeed. Karen, and of course, let me correct myself. Peggy is totally right. Of course, Canada did come late to the game, and I'll correct myself on that point. Karen, let's delve directly, if we can, into this issue of Palestine, right? Because that seemed to have been a fairly important issue going into this vote, at least on the part of those organizations and individuals that spoke up in that regard. How big a part do you think that may have played, especially considering we know Norway and Ireland are seemingly more balanced in their views when it comes to the occupied territories?
Yeah, thank you so much. It would seem that Palestine, certainly the last time when Canada did vie for a United Nations Security Council seat, it was certainly said during the Harper government time, the Conservative government, that it really was the issues related to Israel and the anti-Palestine vote that lost the seat. One would never really know, but certainly the record stands for itself. Certainly things hadn't changed with Trudeau coming into power since 2015, with still 66 votes against Palestine motions at the United Nations. So our sense is, in terms of the civil engagement from around the world, from organizations, from individuals, and the dialogue that followed, the letter writing that followed, that people were talking to their own countries, their own ambassadors, and just bringing the facts to the table. The fact that Canada has voted consistently against resolutions for human rights and international law regarding Palestine, where Ireland and Norway both have been consistent and stalwart in supporting those resolutions.
Corey, do you think that means that Canada may possibly reflect on this in regards to the Palestine issue, or do you think that other policies possibly, because of course I imagine it's not just about the Palestine issue, which Canada may have lost the seat because of, but nevertheless, do you think that the Canadians will self-reflect and possibly decide that it's time for a more balanced approach to that?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. I would hope so. And this is really an interesting time, I think, in the social movements in Canada and amongst civil society. I think it's a really important opportunity for the Canadian government to reflect, with Canadians about what a better foreign policy could be, and what a foreign policy that could get them on the Security Council of the UN could look like. We just conducted a poll. We just released the first part of it, in which we saw that the vast majority of Canadians do want Canada to increase support for Palestinian human rights. They also want the Canadian government to take more action with regards to climate change and international peacekeeping. Many also support more action with regards to international development. So I think that really gives them solid ground from which to work from. I think, like in many countries, there are strong lobbies, and there are interest groups that push policy in particular directions. And I think it's important, again, that they do listen to Canadians on this one. And in particular on the Palestine issue, as was mentioned, they vote almost exclusively with Israel. So it's time that changes.
Peggy, what are your thoughts? Because I know I'm honing on just that one policy, and I don't want to make it seem like that's the only policy that may have influenced this decision on the part of the international community. But nevertheless, it's an important one, right? Because Canada's always been seen around the world, at least, as a fairly balanced country, as a fairly neutral country, a peaceful country, et cetera. And of course, there are arguments for and against that, I imagine, within the country. Nevertheless, on the issue of Palestine, how important is that, and what do you make of Canadian policies in that regard?
Well, like Corey, I'm really, really hopeful that there will be more reflection on Canada's approach with respect, especially on the UN votes with respect to Israel-Palestine, but also other things like our fair trade agreement with Israel, which has sections which contravene international law with respect to goods from the occupied territories. So I certainly hope that there's more reflection here. And the polling that's being done by organizations like Corey Balsam's and others is so important to show where Canadians stand. Because I want to go back a little bit and say we haven't always perpetually been this way. There's actually been a slow trend. I mean, back when I was the ambassador at the UN, we would never be isolated. Canada was never voting with United States and Israel and the Marshall Islands with everybody else on the other side. If we did take a position not in accordance with the majority on issues related to Israel-Palestine, we did it in what was called good company, like-minded, like the Irish and the Norwegians and the Dutch. And what happened is, post-September 11, we've seen this trend, this hardening in various areas. And then we had a hard right, not really a traditional Canadian conservative, but a hard right conservative government, the Harper government, and they were very anti-UN and very pro-Israel, and they took this position of Canada, joining with United States and Israel against the rest of the UN. I mean, the antithesis of what a good UN citizen, good global citizen does. Yeah. And unfortunately, that was playing domestic politics. And unfortunately, the Liberals have really been captured by that. And that's part of what I hope we're getting out of. And that is the Israeli lobby in Canada is very powerful. I mean, Corey Balsam can speak to this much better than me. And part of the problem we've had is the Canadian media is very reluctant to get into this because they then become the subject of endless complaints of unbalanced treatment from a very powerful and well-funded lobby. And so they're reluctant. They stay out of it. They can't spend all their time trying to defend their articles. Yeah. But what's happening recently is we've been seeing some much more courageous reporters who are starting to focus on this. And that's one of the reasons why this issue and why the work of various advocates and this letter from civil society, this huge letter to the UN, why it mattered, because it got coverage in the Canadian media. And that led to the Prime Minister actually speaking out publicly against annexation for the first time. So the domestic side of it is incredibly important. And this is an opportunity to go forward on this.
Okay, unfortunately, we're quickly running out of time. So, Karen, I'm going to give you the final word on this discussion about that issue of annexation, right? It seems that a lot of the international community, even those who are traditional Israeli allies, even the Europeans, for example, have spoken up against the annexation. Do you think that Canada is well placed to lead in that regard, in the sense to put pressure on the Israelis not to go ahead with the West Bank and Jordan Valley annexation?
Very important voice in that regard. Whether Canada will take that full lead, certainly there was indication, but a little bit too late to the game and not very much last week in that regard. So certainly that is an area of focus and to have Canada speak out on annexation. But so much more is required, as Wendy and Corey have said. And I mean, really what this has been about from our perspective is to have a broader conversation on Canada's foreign policy, be it on regard to Palestine or other issues as well.
I'm just going to take a quick minute as well and give Corey, in fact, time to say something about that as well. Corey, what are your thoughts on annexation and Canada's place in the argument against it and how much it can possibly pressurize the Israelis not to go ahead with that?
Yeah, thanks. We've seen the Canadian government sort of be forced to take a position on it. The Canadian government's taken a very strong position against Russia with sanctions regarding Crimea. We think it would only be consistent to continue in that same vein with regards to Israel, though, of course, it would be much more difficult. But yeah, if they really do want to start thinking about and changing their approach to these issues, I think that would be a good start to really take this annexation issue seriously. Canada is a very close friend of Israel. They constantly remind us about that. And if they are such close friends, I think it would be good on them to advise their friends to not take this step and in general to start respecting Palestinian human rights.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that. Of course, we appreciate all three of our guests for their time and their insight today. Peggy, they're speaking to us from Ottawa. Corey speaking to us from Montreal. And Karen, they're speaking to us from Toronto this morning. We appreciate, of course, the context as well they brought because, you know, Canadian foreign policy, I think sometimes when it comes to the international community, is sort of lost in translation, at least on the part of many people around the world who just see Canada as a peace-loving country. And for a large part, of course, a lot of Canadians would argue that is true. However, when it comes down to the policies themselves, some of them are disturbing, especially when it comes to the track record of how Canada has voted in recent years. As Peggy there pointed out, it wasn't always like that. From what she knows at the United Nations, specifically from the time that she served there, Canada was not always completely in favor of Israel and against the Palestinians, seemingly, of course. Canada would argue it's still pro-Palestine in the sense of it's taking a balanced view. However, that is not what its recent track record at least has been at the UN. Did that play a part in whether Canada lost the Security Council seat bid or not? Of course, that's an argument that can be made. But of course, I imagine there are other policies, as I said to our guests, which may have played a part as well in this regard. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss that ongoing battle between John Bolton, the previous U.S. National Security Advisor, and the Trump White House, where the White House has wanted to block the publication of his book, which already pretty much is going to be out next week, seemingly having lost that battle. Nevertheless, they've still asked the federal judge to order that book be stopped from publication. We are now getting tidbits of what is within that book, and a lot of that is very juicy content, as one may appreciate, of course, from a news angle, regarding Trump, of course, asking the Chinese to support him coming into the 2020 elections, his ignorance about whether or not the UK has nuclear weapons. I mean, those are just a few examples. But what does this say about Donald Trump? Because John Bolton, you'll remember, was, at least when he was at the White House, seemingly quite supportive of Donald Trump. So what exactly turned him off about the president? How did that relationship go sour? Because it seemed that their policies were fairly in line, at least from the outside in. Let's put that to our guests who are joining us now. We're now joined by Brandon W. Lenoir, who is an assistant professor of political science and strategic communication at High Point University. He's joining us now from High Point, North Carolina. Joining us from Nottingham in the UK is Todd Landman, who is a professor of political science at the University of Nottingham. And joining us from Budapest is Stanley, who is a lecturer at Corvinus University in Budapest, teaching diplomacy and intercultural communication. He's also been a consultant and board member for several American NGOs. Stanley, Todd, and Brandon, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Brandon, let me start with you. What do you make of this entire effort by the White House to block the publication of Bolton's book, even though seemingly they've already vetted it once?
Well, I think that they're concerned about some of the information that's contained inside it. I mean, we're rolling into an election cycle, and the president is concerned about re-election. That's actually one of the points that John Bolton brings up in his book, pointing out that everything that the president is doing is focused on re-election. I think that the president is concerned about being a one-term president, and he wants to stop any information that's out there that puts him in a bad light.
Right, and which makes, I guess, Todd, doesn't it? But at the end of the day, according to Bolton's understanding and according to the understanding of the rest of us, a president should be putting the interests of the country ahead of his own interests, right? Do you believe that Donald Trump has done just that, where he's preferred himself over the rest of the country?
I think what we see that comes out of the book, at least what we've seen so far, is there are new revelations, but they're not surprising to me. I was reflecting on Ted Lowy's book, The Personal President, which actually talks about the centralization of executive authority that's taken place in the United States over its history. And you add to that this personal dimension, almost a transactional way of looking at governing the United States that Trump has embodied. That it's all about the art of the deal. It's all about what I do for one person, what one person does for me, what can we agree between us that will benefit both of us. And so that's not surprising in the Bolton book. It's actually quite consistent with the way Trump has engaged in his business affairs. It's what he promised to do when he became president, in a way that he was going to take a business angle to running the country. The downside of all of that is that this transactional behavior produces, dare I say, the quid pro quo style of engagement that has not served the country well. And if Bolton is correct that he's absolutely obsessed with re-election, then that will cloud his judgment as to what is in the best interest of the United States.
Stanley, what are your thoughts on that? Because, another big thing was that, Bolton saying obstruction of justice was essentially a way of life for the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think just to kind of mirror what the other two have already said, basically you're looking at a case where the president is very, very focused on getting reelected. And so because of that, he's trying to work out some kind of optic that makes him look good. So he's basically doing everything he can. As we have a little bit of revelation from the book already, for example, in the case of China, apparently, if it's true, he was asking China for help to make him look better to the core group of voters he thinks are going to vote for him again in November. So it's obvious that even though he's saying one thing about China, that is, we need to rein them in or protect our country from them. On the other hand, he really knows that China is almost necessary as a buyer of American goods to kind of prop up certain parts of the groups that he would like to keep on his side. And so, yeah, I highly agree with everybody else that he really is doing this transactionally. He's looking at what he can squeeze out of it, and that's best for him.
Brandon, I wonder how much, whenever this book does come out, and it's supposed to come out next week, if I imagine a court doesn't completely block it, which I possibly is unlikely at this point. But let's just say the book comes out in full and we find out probably other such revelations as well. How much would this really hurt Trump's chances in November? Because his voting base seems to be very loyal, doesn't it?
Well, and that's a very good point. The fact is, what's going to happen right now is it's a question of who do you believe? Do you believe the president or do you believe John Bolton? Right now, the opponents of the president are believing John Bolton. The supporters of the president are calling Bolton a liar. But it really comes down to the swing voters, the independents that are somewhere in the middle that are going to decide the outcome of this election. Is this information, the revelations from inside the White House, enough to sway them to vote Democratic or to still support the president? And that's really what's going to decide the outcome of this election.
What do you make of that? Because, it's fun to obviously pick on Trump when he doesn't know everything about everything around the world, right? But I mean, there's some basic things. I mean, for him not to know that the UK has nuclear weapons, for example, that sort of just defies logic. I mean, the moment I read that, I sort of, took a step back and, you just think that this is the US president we're speaking about who possibly should really know something that important about a key ally. Why does that not hurt him more when it comes to his base? Why are they so loyal to him? I mean, I'm still trying to understand that dynamic.
Well, a certain element of this is that the base probably don't know that Britain's a nuclear power either. And also, it's not important to them. What's important to them is the economy, institutions, cultural things that are happening in the States. They're very much concerned about the United States itself. And just to add to what's been said, in the swing states, we're seeing quite a lot of those swing states that were crucial to Trump's victory in the last election actually slipping away from him. And, the poll of polls led by 538 website, for example, are showing a decline in approval for the president, as well as a widening gap between electoral support for Joe Biden versus Trump. My only worry is that this revelation and this book publication is actually still pretty far out from Election Day. And the news cycle, people's memory, collective amnesia, whatever you want to call it, is one that really, when people go to the voting booths in November, they're going to be thinking about really the last couple of weeks or maybe even month before the election. And it all depends on what the stickability of this story is and all the revelations in it, and whether people read it, whether they care about it, or if they've already made up their minds. I would say that, with the swing votes going the way, or the swing states sliding the way they're sliding, the bigger challenge is definitely for Trump to regain the trust of those voters in those states. And at the moment, that trust is slipping.
Let me go to you, Brandon, with that question then on the foreign policy point. I think the rest of the world may be thinking, I mean, we're obviously looking from this, sitting from my vantage point too, from the outside in. In a sense, Donald Trump has been a very different image of the United States than we've seen, especially, for example, under Barack Obama, who had very good PR. Do you think that a book of this sort of revelations about his knowledge or lack of, about even his allies, will really make a difference for them?
I would have to assume, we're getting a little bit outside of my area of research, but I would have to assume that the people in foreign countries and foreign leaders that are going to believe John Bolton over the president already have kind of slided into the side of not really caring for Donald Trump. So I don't know how big of an impact this is going to have. You know, we have to remember that John Bolton was pushed out of the administration. He claims that he resigned. The president says that he got fired. But it's clear that the split was not amicable. So some might look at it as a disgruntled employee taking a swipe at their employer. But on the flip side, because John Bolton actually has quite an extensive resume working in multiple administrations and in various capacities, it's not like he was just a stuffed shirt that was brought in to work in the administration. He has a lot of credibility. So I have to assume that there are some world leaders that are going to read the book and probably have some concerns.
All right, I believe Stanley with us. Stanley, if you can hear me, just tell us about the from your vantage point there in Hungary, about possibly how even an ally like Hungary, because we know Viktor Orban, a lot of his ideas are fairly similar to Donald Trump's when it comes to immigration and otherwise. Do you think that these sorts of revelations make any difference to such relationships?
Well, first of all, I think it's just going to be a big revelation, let's say, in terms of the fact that this stuff is coming out. And so it's obvious that, to be perfectly honest, that the Trump White House doesn't seem to be able to really hold on to, let's say, kind of sensitive information. Even if the council later decides that nothing needs to be done about it, the fact is that this kind of stuff came out, and he has gotten enough people that are unhappy with what's going on to come out and publicly say so. In terms of how this will affect things diplomatically, again, first of all, I think that it will make a lot of the allies of the United States, or people who are aligned, let's say, with Trump or with the United States, it will give them a little pause because they're going to wonder, well, if I come have discussions with Mr. Trump, is that kind of thing going to leak from someone's memoir at some point in the future? And so I think it's going to give people at least a little bit of pause. In terms of surprise, I do have some context diplomatically. I have talked with quite a few people in a couple of different of the embassies around. And quite frankly, I think they know what they're dealing with. And so I don't know if this will be a big surprise to them, though I think it will be a surprise that it's come out so publicly.
All right, Todd, I'll give you the word. You know, we've seen Trump successfully spin a lot of the attacks against him, right, Todd? We've seen the Russia collusion. We've seen a lot of those sorts of things play out ever since he was even just candidate Trump. And then when he became president, it seems to have been, ever since then, it's been nonstop, right? One thing after another seems to be going against him. But nevertheless, he's been able to spin it as attacks on him. And he's essentially, for lack of a better word, a martyr, right? Where he's been able to stand up against these attacks and come out unscathed or scathed to a certain extent, but still standing. Do you think that that may very well still happen in this regard?
Yes, I mean, he's battled off things in the past, from his business life all the way through the campaign. Certainly the Billy Bush revelations on the bus was the first, shocking revelation, most shocking, I should say. And then people look back and look forward at what's happened. He has been more Teflon than Teflon. We used to describe Ronald Reagan as the Teflon president, but this one really does. His ability to fend off a lot of these revelations has been quite remarkable. So this will be another story alongside many of the other books. His niece is about to publish a book that has some damaging revelations about family life in it. There'll be other things that come out between now and November. But he has been very effective at communicating against these things, spinning things, and playing the victim, I think, rather effectively. So we'll see how it all pans out in November. But these revelations, for me, are not surprising, but they will run on for some time, and we just have to see how they end up affecting the election.
Very well. We'll leave that, but of course we appreciate all three of our guests for their time and of course their expert insight. That was Todd speaking to us from Nottingham in the UK. Brandon was speaking to us this morning from High Point, North Carolina, and Stanley Ward was speaking to us from Budapest in Hungary as well. Viewers, we've tried to give you, the point of view about exactly what this book may entail, and of course we've already had some tidbits coming out vis-a-vis Trump requesting the Chinese to help him win the re-election. The Chinese, of course, have said they do not interfere in any other country's internal affairs as a point of policy. That reaction already came out this morning from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. Nevertheless, there are other revelations in it. Donald Trump not knowing that the UK is a nuclear power. I mean, a lot of these these sorts of things seem very comical from the outside in. Nevertheless, this is the U.S. president we're speaking about, and he should know these very basic things about his allies. What else does he not know about the rest of the world around him? Of course, he's not a career diplomat, so you can't expect him to know everything about everything, just like nobody can know everything about everything. But why isn't he being briefed properly before he says these sorts of things, even in diplomatic private meetings, where then, of course, these things can be revealed later on? And as one of our guests said, what if a future leader or leaders right now from around the world have a discussion with Trump? Will that all come out? Because it seems that Donald Trump is the president who keeps having these leaks coming out somehow or the other about what he said, even in private meetings. And that, I imagine, worries allies and foes alike. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.